The frat president spent 3 hours harassing me at a party, not knowing I was his boss's daughter. I showed up at my very first frat party my freshman year and immediately ran into Adam. To everyone else there, Adam was the frat president. But I knew him as the unpaid intern who'd been fetching coffee for my dad for the past 3 months, desperate to score his dream job at my dad's firm. I recognized him, but it became immediately clear that he did not remember me. "Well, hello," Adam said, looking me up and down with a smile that probably worked on most freshmen. "I'm Adam, president here. You're definitely new. I'd remember a face like yours." He stepped closer, blocking my path to the main room. "Let me get you a drink, give you the VIP tour." Not everyone gets personal attention from the president. When I politely declined and tried to move past him, his smile faltered. "Really? You're turning me down? Do you know who I am on this campus?" I escaped to the kitchen where some girls from my dorm were mixing drinks. 10 minutes late, Adam appeared again, this time less friendly. "You know, I don't usually give second chances, but I'll make an exception. You're new, you don't understand how things work here." He wedged himself between me and my friends. "These parties happen because of me. The least you could do is be friendly." When I said I was fine with my friends, he laughed. "These aren't your friends. They're just being nice because you're pathetic and they feel bad for you." My dorm mates looked uncomfortable but didn't know what to do as Adam continued. "Let me explain something about college freshmen. Girls like you, bookish, boring, probably got in here with daddy's help. You peak at getting invited to parties like this. This is literally the best your social life will ever get, and you're wasting it by rejecting me." He turned to my friends. "You can go. She's fine with me." They hesitated but eventually drifted away, leaving me trapped against the counter. I managed to slip away to the backyard where people were playing beer pong. 20 minutes of peace ended when Adam found me talking to a guy from my economics class. "Bro, you don't want to waste your time here," Adam told him, throwing his arm around the guy's shoulders. "She's one of those girls who thinks she's saving herself for someone special. Probably has a purity ring in her dorm room." The guy looked confused, but Adam steered him away. "Trust me, I'm doing you a favor. She's the type who'd cry during her first kiss." Now I was alone by the fire pit, and Adam sat down next to me. "You're not very smart, are you? I run this social scene and I'm about to land a job at the biggest firm in the state. And you're what? Some nobody freshman who can't even dress for a party?" He touched my cardigan. "Did your mom pick this out? You look like you're going to a church potluck." I stood up to leave, but he followed me inside, grabbing my wrist when I tried to head for the door. "Where are you going?" "We're just talking." His grip was tight enough to hurt. "You know what your problem is? You think you're special. But I see 20 of you every year. Uptight freshmen who think they're too good." The party was getting more crowded and louder, making it harder to get away. Adam pulled me into a corner by the stairs, using his body to block me in. "I'm going to give you one more chance to be cool about this. Have a drink with me. Loosen up. Stop acting like I'm some creep when I'm literally the best thing at this party." When I tried to duck under his arm, he slammed his hand against the wall. "I'm talking to you. Do you know how many girls would kill to get my attention?" His frat brothers walked by and he called out to them. "Guys, look at this. The freshman virgin is too good for us." They laughed and formed a semicircle, making it impossible to leave. "She probably thinks she's going to marry some nice guy from her study group," one said. Adam nodded. "She doesn't realize nice guys don't want uptight girls who can't even handle a party. You're going to be alone forever." I finally pushed through them and ran upstairs, looking for a bathroom to lock myself in. Adam followed me, catching the door before I could close it. "Are you hiding from me? In my own house?" He pushed his way in. "You're pathetic. Crying because a guy tried to be nice to you? This is why you'll never matter to anyone. You're weak, boring, and probably only here because your daddy donated money." He grabbed my phone from my hand. "Who you gonna call? Campus security. They work for us during parties." When I started actually crying, he laughed and opened the door, shoving me out into the hallway where everyone could see. "Look, everyone, it's freshman initiation time." He suddenly poured his beer over my head, the cold liquid making me gasp. "There, now you have an excuse to leave. Run home to your single dorm room and your stuffed animals." The beer ran into my eyes. Adam stood over me as I sat on the floor. "Why don't you call mommy and daddy to pick you up? I'm sure they're used to bailing out their failure of a daughter." I looked up at him through my tears and realized that was actually a great idea. I pulled out my phone, wiping beer off the screen, and dialed my dad's number, putting it on speaker. "Dad, can you pick me up? I'm at a party with Adam, your intern Adam. He just poured beer on me." Adam froze. My dad's voice came through the speaker loud and clear, asking if I needed him to come get me right now. The whole hallway went dead quiet as everyone heard him say Adam's name and call him his intern. Adam's face turned white as a sheet while he stared at my phone like it might bite him. I told Dad yes, please come get me, and asked him to stay on the phone until he got here. My voice was shaky, but I made sure everyone could hear me clearly. Adam started backing away from me, his mouth opening and closing but no words coming out. The crowd in the hallway started whispering and pulling out their phones to record what was happening. People were pointing at Adam and I could hear someone say his career was over before it even started. Adam's frat brothers looked totally confused about why their president suddenly looked so scared. Charlotte pushed through the crowd and rushed over to me, helping me stand up from the floor. She took one look at my beer-soaked clothes and saw the red marks on my wrist where Adam had grabbed me. Without saying anything, she stepped right between me and Adam, blocking him from getting any closer. Dad's voice came through the phone saying he was already in the car and would be there in 15 minutes. He asked if campus security was there, and when I said no, He told me he was calling them himself while driving. I could hear him dialing on another phone in the background. Adam finally found his voice and started moving toward me, saying we should talk about this privately and work things out. Charlotte told him to back off in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. More students moved in around us, forming a protective wall between Adam and me. Someone in the crowd shouted that Adam's career at the firm was definitely over now. Two of Adam's frat brothers grabbed his arms and tried to pull him away, telling him he needed to leave before this got worse. But Adam just stood there frozen, staring at me like he was watching his whole future fall apart. One of his brothers asked what was happening and why Adam looked so scared, but Adam couldn't even answer him. The guy just kept staring at me with his mouth hanging open. Within minutes, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs and Sean from campus security appeared in the hallway. Dad must have given them the exact address because Sean came straight to me. He looked at my wet clothes and immediately asked if I needed medical attention for my wrist. I showed him the red marks and he took photos with his phone while asking if Adam had done this. I nodded and kept the phone on speaker so Dad could hear everything that was happening. I started telling Sean about the 3 hours of harassment, making sure he wrote down every single detail. How Adam had followed me around the party, blocked my path, grabbed my wrist, and then poured beer on me. Adam tried to interrupt and give his version of events, but Sean held up his hand and told him to wait his turn. More campus security officers arrived along with 2 campus police officers who started taking statements from people in the hallway. Several students came forward right away to say they saw Adam pour the beer on me. A girl from my dorm told them she heard Adam calling me pathetic and saying horrible things. One guy said he saw Adam grab my wrist when I tried to leave earlier. The officers were writing everything down while Adam stood there looking smaller and smaller. His frat brothers had all disappeared by now, not wanting to be connected to whatever was about to happen to him. Charlotte stayed right next to me the whole time, holding my hand while I talked to the officers. Dad stayed on the phone, occasionally asking questions to make sure I was okay and that the officers were doing their job. I could hear his car engine and knew he was driving fast to get to me. The campus police officer asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint and press charges for assault. Before I could answer, Dad's voice came through the speaker, telling me not to make any decisions until he got there. Adam's eyes got even wider when he heard that, probably realizing this wasn't going to just go away. The officer gave me a card with an incident number and said we could decide about charges later. Sean asked Adam for his ID and started writing up his own report about what he'd observed. Adam's hands were shaking as he pulled out his wallet. More and more students were gathering in the hallway, and I could see several people posting on social media already. Someone said the frat president assaulting a freshman was going to be all over campus by morning. Adam kept looking at me like he wanted to say something, but the officers told him to stay quiet. They separated us, moving Adam down the hall while I stayed with Charlotte and Sean. I could still feel the beer dripping from my hair, and my wrist was starting to throb where he'd grabbed it. Charlotte found some paper towels from the bathroom and helped me clean my face while we waited for Dad. The whole hallway smelled like beer, and I just wanted to get out of there and take a shower. Finally, I heard Dad's voice in person as he came up the stairs, and I'd never been so happy to see him. Dad's face was a kind of mad I'd never seen before, his jaw tight as he took in my beer-soaked hair and the way I was sitting on the floor. He helped me stand up and checked my wrist where Adam had grabbed me, the skin already turning purple. The campus police officers were asking everyone to stay put while they took statements, and Dad told them in this calm but scary voice that he was Adam's employer at his law firm. Adam's whole body went stiff when Dad said that Adam's internship was terminated immediately. No discussion needed. The color drained from Adam's face and he started babbling about how this was all a big misunderstanding, how he didn't know who I was, how he was just joking around. Dad turned to him and said harassment was wrong no matter who the victim was, and the fact that Adam thought it would have been okay if I wasn't his daughter made it worse. The officers started taking photos of my bruised wrist and my beer-soaked clothes, asking if I wanted to press charges for assault. I told them I needed time to think about it and they handed me a card with an incident number written on it. Charlotte was gathering my purse and cardigan from where I'd dropped them, while 2 officers took Adam aside to question him about grabbing my wrist and pouring beer on me. His frat brothers had all vanished, probably not wanting to be connected to whatever was about to happen to their president. Dad kept his hand on my shoulder while we walked down the stairs and out to his car, Charlotte following us and saying she'd drive behind us to make sure we got home safe. The second I got in Dad's car and the door closed, everything hit me at once and I started sobbing, my whole body shaking from what had just happened. Dad reached over and squeezed my hand, telling me none of this was my fault, and that Adam would face every single consequence coming to him. We pulled into our driveway and Charlotte parked behind us, following us inside where I went straight to the bathroom for a shower. I stood under the hot water for what felt like forever, trying to wash the smell of beer out of my hair while I could hear Charlotte in the kitchen making tea. Through the bathroom door, I could hear Dad on the phone with someone named Wyatt Tanner, who I knew was the managing partner at his firm. Dad was explaining what had happened at the party and formally requesting that Adam's internship be terminated immediately with no chance of future employment. After my shower, I put on pajamas and found Charlotte waiting in my room with the tea and some cookies she'd found in the pantry. She stayed the night and we spent hours documenting everything, taking more photos of my wrist, which was now dark purple, saving all the texts I'd sent her during the party when I was trying to get away from Adam. We wrote down a timeline of everything that had happened, from when Adam first approached me to when Dad arrived. Charlotte mentioned she knew at least 2 other girls who Adam had cornered at parties, girls who might be willing to talk about their experiences too. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with dozens of messages from people who were at the party. Some were asking if I was okay, others just wanted details about what happened, and a few were angry that the frat might get in trouble because of me. Charlotte helped me delete most of them without reading, only responding to my actual friends who were genuinely worried about me. Dad had taken the day off work and was in the kitchen making pancakes when we came downstairs, acting like this was totally normal even though he never cooked. While we ate, he explained my options in this really calm way, saying I could press criminal charges, file a complaint with the university, or do both. He kept saying it was completely my choice and he'd support whatever I decided, but I could tell he wanted Adam to face real consequences. The phone rang while we were cleaning up, and it was Wyatt Tanner calling to confirm that Adam's internship had been terminated that morning. He also mentioned that Adam had already been on thin ice because several female staff members had complained about him making them uncomfortable, asking for their numbers and standing too close during meetings. Wyatt said Adam was now banned from the firm's property, and his keycard had been deactivated, and if he tried to come to the building, security would remove him. Dad thanked him and hung up, then looked at me and asked what I wanted to do next. 3 days later, I told Dad I wanted to report everything to the university, and he drove Charlotte and me to campus for the Title IX appointment he'd already scheduled. The office was in the admin building's 3rd floor, and Layla Garcia was waiting with a stack of forms and pamphlets spread across her desk. She had me go through everything that happened at the party while she typed notes on her computer, asking specific questions about times and witnesses and whether I had any evidence. Charlotte showed her the texts I'd sent during the party, and the photos of my bruised wrist, and Layla printed everything for the file. She explained how the investigation would work, that they'd interview Adam and any witnesses we could name, and that the process usually took about 60 days but could be longer. She handed me a no-contact order that she'd already filled out, saying Adam couldn't approach me anywhere on campus, couldn't text or call or email me, and if he violated it, he'd face immediate suspension. The order went into effect that day, and campus security would be notified within the hour. We spent 2 hours in her office going through my rights as a complainant, the possible outcomes ranging from warnings to expulsion, and how I could have a support person at any meetings. By the time we left, I had a folder full of resources and Layla's direct number programmed in my phone. Word spread across campus faster than I expected, and by Monday morning, everyone seemed to know what had happened at the party. Walking into the dining hall for breakfast, I could feel people staring and heard whispers following me to the cereal station. Charlotte stayed right next to me, shooting looks at anyone who stared too long, and we found a corner table where we could eat without feeling like we were on display. Some people I'd never talked to before came up to say they were sorry about what happened, while others just pointed and whispered to their friends. In my psych lecture that afternoon, people kept turning around to look at me, and the professor had to ask everyone to face forward twice. Between classes, I got an email notification from an address I didn't recognize, and Dad called me immediately to say Adam's lawyer had sent something, but our lawyer would handle it so I didn't need to read it. He said it was Adam trying to apologize and asking me not to pursue charges because it would ruin his future, which Dad called manipulative garbage that we'd add to our evidence file. The lawyer had already drafted a cease and desist response reminding Adam about the no-contact order. That same week, 3 different girls messaged me on Instagram saying they'd had similar experiences with Adam at other parties. One sophomore described how he'd cornered her in the basement during homecoming weekend. Another freshman said he'd grabbed her at a mixer and wouldn't let go until her boyfriend showed up, and a junior told me about Adam following her to her car after she rejected him at a party last year. We met at the campus coffee shop, and they agreed to talk to Layla together, so I set up another appointment and we all went to the Title IX office. Layla took each of their statements separately, while the rest of us waited in the lobby, and when she came out after the last interview, she said this established a clear pattern of predatory behavior that would strengthen the investigation. The frat got pulled into an emergency review by Greek Life 2 days after the other girls came forward, and they had to suspend all social events while the investigation was happening. This made a lot of the brothers angry, and some of them started posting on social media about how one person was ruining their whole semester, though they didn't use my name directly. Charlotte screenshot everything before they could delete it, adding it to our growing evidence folder. I started having nightmares about the party and couldn't focus during lectures, so Charlotte walked me to the counseling center and waited while I had my first appointment with Gabriela Diaz. Gabriela had me describe what happened and then explained that freezing when Adam grabbed me was a completely normal trauma response, that my brain was trying to protect me by shutting down instead of fighting. She taught me some breathing exercises for when I felt anxious, and scheduled me for weekly sessions to work through everything. 2 weeks after I filed the report, Layla called to say the panel had reached a decision after reviewing all the evidence and witness statements. Adam was found responsible for assault, harassment, and creating a hostile environment, and the panel voted to suspend him for 2 years, with a permanent ban from campus property. The decision would be on his transcript if he tried to transfer, and he had 10 days to appeal. His parents hired some expensive lawyer from the city to fight the suspension, but Layla said with 4 victims giving consistent statements and multiple witnesses from the party, the appeal probably wouldn't change anything. The lawyer apparently told Adam's parents to accept the punishment and focus on damage control instead of making things worse with a long appeal. My professors had been notified about the situation through the Dean of Students' office, and worked with me on extensions for papers and moving my economics discussion section to a different time, so I wouldn't have to see Adam's empty seat 3 times a week. 3 days later, the district attorney's office called my cell while I was eating lunch with Charlotte in the dining hall. The prosecutor said they'd reviewed the police report and witness statements and wanted to meet about pressing assault and battery charges against Adam. I set up an appointment for the next afternoon and brought Dad and Gabriela with me to the courthouse downtown. The prosecutor laid out photos of my bruised wrist on her desk and explained that with multiple witnesses and the beer assault on video from someone's phone, they had a strong case. She said Adam could face up to a year in jail if convicted, but would probably get probation as a first offense. I signed the paperwork to move forward with charges while Dad squeezed my shoulder. Meanwhile, Charlotte had been busy organizing what she called my protection squad, recruiting 8 girls from our dorm who started walking with me to every class. They'd show up at my door each morning and we'd move across campus as a group, making me feel safe for the first time since the party. At meals, they surrounded me at our usual table, creating a buffer zone from stares and whispers. One of them even started sitting next to me in my big lecture classes, taking notes when my hands shook too much to write. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning when Adam showed up at his parents' house for spring break. Police knocked on the door at 7 a.m. with a warrant and took him to the station in handcuffs while neighbors watched from their driveways. His mugshot appeared on the local news website by noon, showing him in an orange jumpsuit with dark circles under his eyes. He posted bail that afternoon, but the judge set strict conditions, including staying 500 feet from campus and having zero contact with me directly or through third parties. The frat house got shut down 2 weeks after his arrest, when the Greek life investigation found evidence of hazing, underage drinking, and multiple unreported assault incidents over 3 years. The national chapter pulled their charter immediately, and the university gave the brothers 30 days to move out. Adam's name appeared in every article as the president who destroyed a 90-year-old fraternity through his actions. Some of his former brothers started reaching out through Instagram and email to apologize for not stopping him that night. One guy met me at the library and admitted they all knew Adam got aggressive with girls when he drank, but nobody wanted to challenge him because he controlled their social lives. Another sent a long message about how watching Adam pour beer on me made him realize he'd been a coward for 3 years. Dad called an emergency meeting at his firm the Monday after Adam's arrest and implemented new policies for all interns and employees. Background checks became mandatory, including social media reviews and reference calls to previous employers. He also brought in consultants to run harassment training sessions that everyone had to attend, even the senior partners. He told me later that Adam had taught him an expensive lesson about the importance of really knowing who you're bringing into your company. The preliminary hearing happened 6 weeks after I pressed charges, in a small courtroom downtown with wood paneling and uncomfortable benches. Adam's lawyer tried to paint the whole thing as typical college behavior that got blown out of proportion. He kept using phrases like youthful mistake and party atmosphere while I sat there with Charlotte holding my hand. The judge, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight, looked at the photos of my wrist and watched the video of the beer assault twice. She said she'd seen plenty of college parties in her career, and none of them gave anyone the right to physically restrain and humiliate another person. When spring semester started, Charlotte and I moved to a different dorm on the opposite side of campus from the old frat house. Our new hallmates had heard about what happened and immediately adopted us into their group. They had a whole system of checking in on each other through a group chat, and nobody went to parties alone. Our RA was a senior who'd been through something similar her freshman year, and she made our floor a safe space where we could talk about anything. 3 months after the arrest, Adam's lawyer contacted mine about a plea deal to avoid trial. He'd plead guilty to misdemeanor assault in exchange for 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling for anger management. He also had to pay all my medical bills from the wrist injury and therapy sessions, which came to almost $8,000. The judge approved the deal, and I didn't have to testify at trial, which Gabriella said would help my healing process. The university used our case as a catalyst for major changes to Greek life policies and training requirements. They created something called the Party Safety Initiative that all Greek organizations had to participate in before hosting any social events. It covered consent, bystander intervention, and the consequences of harassment with real examples from recent cases. They asked if they could use my story anonymously in the training materials, and I agreed because maybe it would stop another Adam from thinking he could get away with it. Charlotte started dragging me to small gatherings in our new dorm, just 5 or 6 people watching movies in the common room at first. She'd sit next to me the whole time, and we had this system where I'd tap her knee twice if I needed to leave. The first party we went to after everything was a birthday thing for someone on our floor, and Charlotte brought 3 other girls from our hallway with us. We all stayed together near the kitchen, and when some guy I didn't know tried to corner me by the drinks, Charlotte appeared out of nowhere and pulled me away to look at something on her phone. Our whole friend group had code words now. Like if anyone texted pizza in the group chat, it meant come get me immediately. I went to therapy every Tuesday at the campus health center, and Gabriella had this way of making me talk through everything without feeling like I was analyzed. 6 months after the party, I could finally sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. Gabriella showed me my intake forms from when I first started, and the difference was shocking. All those symptoms I'd marked as severe were now mild or gone completely. She said speaking up about what happened had helped more than years of therapy might have otherwise, because I'd taken back control. I found out about Adam through the campus rumor mill when someone mentioned seeing his name on a transfer request at the registrar's office. Charlotte's friend who worked in admissions said he'd applied to 3 other schools in state, but they'd all rejected him after checking his disciplinary record. His LinkedIn disappeared one day, and this guy from his old frat told me at the coffee shop that Adam was working at some electronics store near his parents' house. The same guy said Adam had tried to finish his degree online through some sketchy program that barely counted as accredited. Dad started calling me every Sunday night to check in. Real conversations, not just the quick house school talks we used to have. He'd ask about my classes and friends, but also about how I was handling everything, if I felt safe on campus, if I needed anything. He came to visit more often, too, taking me and Charlotte out to dinner and always making sure I knew he was proud of how I'd handled everything. When he saw guys looking at me the wrong way at restaurants, he'd get this protective look, but he never said anything unless I brought it up first. The university gave Charlotte some award at the end-of-year ceremony for being an outstanding bystander and advocate. She had to go up on stage in front of everyone, and the dean talked about how her actions had made a real difference in a serious situation. Charlotte just laughed about it later and said she was just being a decent human. But I knew how much she'd done for me those months. I switched my major to pre-law after sitting in on one of Layla's presentations about victim advocacy and realizing that's what I wanted to do with my life. My grades went from barely passing to dean's list because I actually cared about what I was studying now. The professors in the legal studies department were mostly former prosecutors and defense attorneys who had real stories about helping people navigate the system. They'd use examples from actual cases, and I'd sit there taking notes thinking about how I could help someone going through what I went through. The old frat house sat empty for months after they shut it down, until the university announced they were converting it into a women's resource center. They gutted the whole place and rebuilt it with meeting rooms, a library, counseling offices, and safe study spaces. At the opening ceremony, they asked me to say a few words, and I just talked for maybe 2 minutes about how important it was to have spaces where women felt protected and supported. Standing in that same building where everything had happened, but seeing it transformed into something positive felt like the universe balancing itself out somehow. This guy who'd been one of Adam's frat brothers came up to me outside the library one day looking really uncomfortable. He said that testifying at Adam's hearing had made him realize how messed up his own behavior had been at parties, and with girls in general. He'd started going to counseling and was volunteering with the campus prevention program, teaching other guys about consent and respect. He thanked me for speaking up because it had opened his eyes to things he'd been ignoring or participating in without thinking. There was this guy in my study group for constitutional law who always saved me a seat and brought extra highlighters because I always forgot mine. He never pushed or made things weird, just was consistently kind and patient even when I flinched at sudden movements or needed to sit near the door. Charlotte met him for coffee 3 times before declaring he passed her test, and when he finally asked me to get dinner off campus, I actually said yes. We went to this Thai place and talked about law school applications, and he didn't try to kiss me or even hold my hand, just walked me back to my dorm and said he had a great time. Charlotte was waiting in my room, and when I told her about the date, she said it was the first time she'd seen me really smile in months. Layla called me into her office one afternoon to ask if she could use my case as an example in training materials for new Title IX coordinators at other schools. She said the way everything had been documented and handled could show others how to properly support survivors and take swift action. She promised to remove identifying details, but wanted to include the timeline and the coordination between different offices. I signed the permission forms feeling like maybe something good could come from all of this if it helped even one other person get the support they needed. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, there was a letter from Adam's parents saying they'd been blind to their son's behavior patterns and were establishing a fund for campus assault prevention programs. The check attached was for $50,000 made out to the university's new safety initiative, and they asked that I be informed but not contacted further about it. Charlotte was sitting next to me when I read it, and she grabbed the letter to read it herself, then said they were probably trying to avoid a civil lawsuit, but at least the money would help other students. That same afternoon, Layla called to tell me about a summer internship opportunity at a firm that specialized in victim advocacy and campus assault cases, and asked if I wanted her to recommend me. I filled out the application that night, and 2 weeks later got an interview where the partners asked about my experience and how I'd want to help other survivors navigate the legal system. They offered me the position on the spot and said they'd been following my case and were impressed with how I'd handled everything. Charlotte and I started looking at apartments for junior year, and we made a list of requirements that included deadbolts, security cameras, first-floor windows with locks, and a building with controlled access. We spent 3 weekends driving around looking at places, and each time we'd test the locks, check the sightlines from the street, and ask about the other tenants. The landlord at one place laughed when Charlotte asked about the response time for police calls, but we just crossed it off our list and kept looking. We finally found a place 6 blocks from campus with everything we wanted, plus a doorman who worked nights and remembered everyone who came and went. The lease signing felt like a big step toward normal life, and we celebrated with ice cream even though it was just a regular Tuesday. 2 days before the semester ended, I got an email from the university president's office saying I'd been selected for the Courage Award at the closing ceremony. Standing at that podium in front of hundreds of people, I kept it short and just said that courage wasn't about not being scared, but about speaking up even when you were terrified. My hands shook the whole time, but I made it through, and when I sat down, Charlotte was crying, and my dad was recording everything on his phone. The last day in my dorm room, I was packing boxes when I found that cardigan shoved in the back of my closet, still in the dry cleaning bag from when Charlotte had taken it to get cleaned months ago. I held it for a minute, remembering that scared girl who thought a cardigan would keep her safe at a party, then folded it carefully and put it in the donation pile. Charlotte helped me carry the boxes down to my dad's car, and as we loaded everything, I looked back at the dorm where everything had started and felt ready to move forward. The donation center was on our way home, and when I handed over the bag with the cardigan, the volunteer smiled and said it would make someone very happy. Thanks for sticking with me through all my questions and wonderings. It's always so interesting exploring this stuff together. Until we meet again, take care. Subscribe for more content like this.
I raised my nephew for 12 years, then my sister showed up and told him I kidnapped him. I raised my nephew Mateo for 10 years, and now he looks at me like I'm some kidnapper who stole his childhood. My sister Mel showed up at my door when I was 24 with baby Mateo, who was 3 months old and living in her car with her. She was high as hell and begging me to watch him for just a few weeks while she got clean. I was a dumb kid fresh out of college making $12 an hour at a marketing firm, but what was I supposed to do? Let my nephew live in a car? I took him in, and those few weeks turned into forever. Man, I had no clue what I was doing. I remember calling my mom at 3 a.m. crying because Mateo wouldn't stop screaming and I'd tried everything. I learned to change diapers on my lunch break in the office bathroom and survived on coffee and whatever Mateo didn't finish. I missed so many nights out with friends and dates because who wants to date a 24-year-old raising a baby that's not even his? But none of that mattered when he smiled at me or reached for me when he was scared. Mel would pop up every year or two making all these promises, then disappearing again, chasing her next high. When Mateo turned 5, I knew I had to make it official, so I filed for guardianship. Mel signed the papers in rehab thanking me for saving her baby, and I thought that was it. Mateo grew up to be a good man, like really good. Honor roll every semester and varsity basketball as a sophomore, and the kid literally helps old ladies with groceries without anyone asking. He called me dad even though I always reminded him I was Uncle Mike because I wanted him to know his truth. Then 2 months ago, my whole world imploded. Mel showed up at his school, apparently having been clean for 2 years, and married to some rich guy with a house that looks like something from MTV Cribs. She told Mateo I stole him, that she'd been begging for him back for years, but I threatened her and used her addiction against her. She had these fake letters she'd supposedly written and made herself out to be this victim who finally found the strength to fight for her baby. Mateo came home and looked at me like I was a stranger, some criminal who'd been lying to him his whole life. He asked me point blank if I kidnapped him from his mother, and I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces. I tried to explain, say that his mom had done things like this before, but he wouldn't hear it. Said his real mom showed him proof and I was a liar who stole him because I wanted a kid. Do you know what it's like to have the person you love most in the world look at you with disgust? The next 6 weeks before court were torture. Mateo barely spoke to me except to ask when he could see his real family. Mel kept texting him pictures of this bedroom she'd decorated, and all these promises about trips to Disney and Europe. I had to listen to him laughing on the phone with her at night, knowing damn well she would use him then forget about him all over again. I wanted to scream that I was the one who stayed up when he had nightmares and taught him to tie his shoes and cheered myself hoarse at every game, but I just kept my mouth shut and gathered my evidence. The custody hearing was brutal. Mateo had to sit there and hear everything, like how Mel left him in that car for hours to score drugs, and how he was hospitalized for dehydration, how she sold his crib for a fix, then had him sleep on the floor. 10 years of receipts and police reports and rehab stints I'd paid for. My lawyer even brought in the social worker who talked about how Mateo thrived with me, but I could see my boy shrinking in his chair with every word. Mel's husband talked about their money and stability, and her lawyer tried to paint me as some creep who stole a baby, but the judge saw through it and threw out their case. But winning didn't fix us. Mateo stayed because he had to, but he calls me Mike now, not Dad. He does his homework and goes to practice, but then locks himself in his room. I see him staring at her Facebook at that stupid house with the pool, and I know he's wondering what if. Last week he asked if I regretted taking him in, and I swear it felt like he reached into my chest and squeezed. I told him my only regret was not protecting him from this pain, and that his mom made him doubt the only parent who never left. He hugged me, but it was hollow, like he was just going through the motions. A few weeks later, she sent him a birthday card with a $1,000 check, even though the court ordered no contact. He didn't cash it, but he didn't throw it away either. I found it in his drawer with printed emails from her saying she'll wait forever for her son to come home. I failed him. I was supposed to protect him, and I couldn't even protect him from this. I was losing my son to a fantasy of a mother who chose doc drugs over him for a decade, and I didn't know how to fight that. Then it happened. Mateo decided to start spending time with his mother. I should have seen it coming. Instead of getting him back, I decided he should stay with her after all. He needed to see for himself the kind of person my sister is. The weekends started culling me slowly. Every Friday afternoon, Mateo would pack his backpack with clothes I'd washed and folded and wait by the window for Mel's Mercedes to pull up. She never came to the door anymore, just honked twice, and he'd bolt out like the house was on fire. I'd stand there watching him climb into that car, watching my sister wave at me with this smug little smile that made my stomach turn. He'd come back Sunday nights different, quieter at first, then buzzing with stories about jet skis and private movie theaters and some chef who made him whatever he wanted. The expensive sneakers started showing up first, then the designer backpack, then the gold chain he tried to hide under his shirt. I found receipts in his pockets for restaurants where appetizers cost more than our weekly grocery budget. I tried to compete in my own pathetic way, made his favorite lasagna from scratch, suggested we catch the new Marvel movie, bought tickets to see his favorite team play. He'd go through the motions, sitting next to me but checking his phone every 5 minutes. Mel was always texting him pictures of vacation spots, asking which one he wanted to visit for spring break, Bali or Paris, Tokyo or Dubai. Meanwhile, I was calculating if I could afford to take him camping for a weekend. The basketball season started, and I went to every game like always. But now Mel and her husband sat in the front row wearing custom jerseys with Mateo's name. They'd cheer louder than me, bring professional photographers, host the whole team for dinner afterward at places I couldn't pronounce. Other parents started treating me different, like I was the weird uncle hanging around while the real family had returned. Mateo stopped asking me to review game film on Fridays, said his mom's husband hired a former NBA player to work with him privately. Our Wednesday superhero nights disappeared because Mel enrolled him in some exclusive tutoring program, even though his grades were perfect. Sunday meal prep turned into me cooking alone while he FaceTimed her from his room, laughing at inside jokes I'd never understand. I kept telling myself the court ruled in my favor for a reason. The judge saw through her lies, recognized I was the stable parent, the one who'd been there. But legal victories don't mean much when your kid's heart is somewhere else. I'd catch him staring at pictures of her house, zooming in on the pool, the game room, the garage full of cars he could drive someday. The guidance counselor called me in after Mateo wrote an essay about identity and belonging that concerned her. He'd written about feeling torn between two lives, wondering who he might have been if things were different. She asked if we were in family therapy, and I just sat there realizing I was losing him in slow motion and didn't know how to stop it. Mel started pushing boundaries, showing up at his practices even though the court order said supervised visits only. She'd wave at me across the gym like we were old friends, like she hadn't tried to destroy our lives. Her husband would shake hands with the coach, probably writing another check for new uniforms or equipment. I'd sit in the bleachers feeling invisible while my son, who wasn't legally my son anymore in his mind, ran drills and avoided looking my way. The breaking point came during a tournament weekend. Mateo's team made it to the championship, and Mel convinced him to stay at her house since it was closer to the venue. I agreed because saying no would make me the bad guy again. He texted me updates at first, pictures of the breakfast spread, the massage chair, the hot tub where the team hung out. Then the texts stopped coming. They won the championship, and I watched from the stands as Mateo ran straight to Mel and her husband for the celebration. I had his favorite victory dinner planned, the tradition we'd kept since his first rec league win, but he said the team was going to Mel's for a party. I drove home alone with his clean uniform in the passenger seat, the one I'd washed 100 times, wondering if I'd ever wash it again. That night I sat in his empty room looking at all the things that made it his, the certificates I'd framed, the trophies we'd polished together, the pictures from every year of school. Mel couldn't erase 10 years of memories, but she was building new ones faster than I could compete with. I wasn't angry at Mateo because what 15-year-old wouldn't be seduced by that life? I was angry at myself for not preparing him better, for not knowing how to fight wealth with love. The next morning, Mateo came home wearing a Rolex, said it was an early birthday present from his mom for making the winning shot. I stared at that watch, worth more than my car, ticking on my kid's wrist like a countdown to when he'd leave for good. He must have seen something in my face because he took it off, said he'd only wear it on special occasions. But we both knew everything at Mel's house was a special occasion. I started documenting everything, not for court, but for my own sanity. Every gift, every boundary crossed, every weekend that ran long. My lawyer said to be patient, that Mel would show her true colors eventually, but patience felt impossible when each day took Mateo further away. I'd find myself driving past her house at night, looking at the lit windows, wondering which room he was in and if he ever thought about home. The school called about Mateo's enrollment forms for next year. He'd listed Mel's address as his primary residence. When I confronted him, he said it was just easier for the district boundaries, that her neighborhood had better academic programs. I pointed out his grades were perfect where he was, but he just shrugged and said he wanted options. That word, options, felt like a knife between my ribs. Mel started planning this elaborate Sweet 16 party for him, even though his birthday was months away. She created a Pinterest board and shared it with him, full of ideas that looked like celebrity events, DJ, catering, custom everything. I asked Mateo what happened to our tradition of breakfast at his favorite diner and a movie marathon, and he said we could still do that too, like it was a consolation prize. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, raining hard, and someone pounded on my door at 2 a.m. I opened it to find Mel soaking wet, makeup running down her face, pupils blown wide. She was sobbing and high, swaying on my porch, begging me to let her in. The smell of vodka mixed with something chemical made me step back. She pushed past me, stumbling into my living room, saying her husband left her, kicked her out, changed the locks, canceled her credit cards. She kept saying she couldn't do it, couldn't be a full-time mom, that Mateo was too much work. The words tumbled out between sobs, how she thought it would be easy with all that money, but the kid had needs and schedules and expected things from her she didn't know how to give. I stood there frozen, watching my sister fall apart on my couch, the same couch where Mateo and I used to build fort cities. She grabbed my hands, her fingers ice cold and shaking, begging me to take him back. Said she'd sign whatever papers I wanted, would tell the judge she lied, anything to make this go away. She just wanted her life back, the parties and trips and freedom. That's when I heard the creak on the stairs. Mateo stood there in his pajamas, eyes wide, taking in the scene. His mother, the one who'd promised him the world, reduced to a sobbing mess, begging to give him away. Again. Mel saw him and her face changed, panic replacing desperation. She tried to stand but stumbled, knocking over the lamp Mateo made me in third grade art class. The words that came next destroyed everything. She screamed that this wasn't supposed to happen, that she only wanted Mateo back to hurt me, to prove she could take him, to show her husband's family she was a good mother, to post pictures on Facebook that made her look reformed. She never wanted to raise a teenager, never wanted the daily grind of parenting. She wanted the title without the work, the photos without the responsibility. Mateo's face went blank. He stood perfectly still as Mel continued her rambling confession, how she'd practiced her sob story for months, how her husband's lawyer coached her on what to say, how the letters were written by someone she paid online. She admitted she'd been using again for weeks, couldn't handle the pressure of pretending to be a mom. Her husband found her stash and threw her out, said she was embarrassing him in front of his colleagues. I wanted to move, to shield Mateo from this, to throw Mel out, to do something, but I couldn't. We all just existed in that horrible moment, the truth hanging in the air like poison. Mel finally noticed the horror on Mateo's face and tried to backtrack, reaching for him, saying she didn't mean it. He backed away like her touch would burn him, then turned and ran upstairs. The sound of his door slamming shook the whole house. Mel looked at me with eyes I recognized from years of her disasters, wanting me to fix this like I always had, but I was done. I told her to leave, that I'd call her a ride to wherever, but she couldn't stay here. She begged and pleaded, but I held firm, even as she accused me of being heartless, of enjoying her downfall. I ordered an Uber to a motel and paid for 3 nights, the last thing I'd ever do for her. After she left, I stood outside Mateo's door for an hour. I could hear him crying, these deep gulping sobs that tore me apart. I knocked softly, told him I was there when he was ready, but he didn't answer. I slid down the wall and sat in the hallway, keeping vigil over his pain like I had when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. The next morning, his room was empty. He'd left for school early, avoiding me, avoiding everything. I found the Rolex on his dresser, the gold chain coiled beside it, the designer clothes piled in the corner. At the bottom of the pile was the birthday card from Mel, torn into tiny pieces. But he'd also taken down our pictures, the ones of us at his games, at Christmas, at all the moments that made us family. Days passed in silence. Mateo went to school, came home, locked his door. He wouldn't eat the dinners I made, wouldn't respond to my texts, wouldn't look at me. I gave him space face but stayed close, leaving plates outside his door, washing his uniforms, keeping his routine intact even if he wouldn't let me be part of it. The school counselor called to say he'd stopped participating in class, was sitting alone at lunch, had quit the tutoring program Mel enrolled him in. I tried everything, wrote him letters explaining my side, apologizing for not protecting him better, telling him how much I loved him. I slid them under his door but never knew if he read them. I reached out to his coach, his favorite teacher, anyone who might get through to him, but he'd built walls around himself that nobody could breach. He was grieving the mother he thought he'd found, the life he thought he'd missed, the fantasy that had felt so real. A week later, I found him sitting in the backyard at 3 a.m., staring at nothing. I sat beside him on the cold grass, close enough to show I was there but far enough to give him space. We sat in silence for an hour before he finally spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. He asked if everyone in our family was broken, if lying was in our DNA, if he was destined to hurt people too. I told him the truth, that yes, our family had problems, that addiction and pain ran deep, but that he got to choose who he became, that being hurt didn't mean he had to hurt others, that being lied to didn't make him a liar. I told him about my own struggles with trust after Mel's betrayals, how I'd worked to break the cycle for him, how proud I was of the man he was becoming, even in this dark moment. He asked why I didn't tell him the truth about Mel from the beginning. I explained that I'd wanted him to form his own opinions, to have hope that people could change, to not carry my anger as his own. Maybe that was wrong, maybe I should have warned him, but I'd wanted to preserve his innocence as long as possible. He said he felt stupid for believing her, for wanting the life she offered, for turning against the only parent who'd stayed. I pulled him close then, this kid who was taller than me now but still needed comfort. I told him he wasn't stupid, that wanting your mother's love was the most natural thing in the world, that Mel's failures weren't his fault, that her inability to love him properly said nothing about his worth. He cried harder than I'd ever seen, 10 years of abandonment and fresh betrayal pouring out onto my shoulder. We stayed outside until the sun came up, talking about everything and nothing, about his fears of being unlovable, about my fears of failing him, about how families could be built on choice instead of blood. He asked if I regretted raising him now that he'd pushed me away, and I told him the only thing I regretted was not being able to spare him this pain, that loving him was the best decision I'd ever made, even when it hurt. The morning light revealed the exhaustion on both our faces, but something had shifted between us. Mateo didn't pull away when I suggested we go inside for breakfast. He helped me make pancakes, moving around the kitchen in comfortable silence, and for a moment it felt like before, but I could see the weight he carried now, the knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. School became his escape. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that worried his teachers. The counselor called again, said he was turning in work that went far beyond requirements, staying after school to help younger students, volunteering for every community service opportunity. She thought it was positive until she realized he was using busyness to avoid processing his pain. I found him reorganizing his room one night, taking down the expensive sneakers from their display shelf, folding the designer clothes into donation bags. He kept only what he'd had before Mel came back, creating a kind of before and after timeline with his possessions. When I offered to help, he shook his head but didn't ask me to leave. Progress came in these small moments, these tiny permissions to exist in his space again. The basketball team noticed the change immediately. Mateo played with a different energy now, aggressive and relentless, like he was trying to sweat out his confusion on the court. His coach pulled me aside after practice, concerned about the shift from his usual strategic style to something more desperate. I watched my boy run himself into exhaustion, staying late to shoot free throws until his arms shook. Then Mel started calling my phone 20, 30 times a day, leaving voicemails that swung between tearful apologies and angry accusations. I blocked her number, but she found others, borrowed phones, created new email accounts. Each message was a fresh manipulation, promising she'd changed, threatening to tell Mateo I was keeping them apart, begging for money, cycling through every tactic she'd perfected over the years. I didn't tell Mateo about the calls, but he knew something was happening. He'd catch me silencing my phone, see the tension in my shoulders when unknown numbers appeared. One evening, he simply said he didn't want to know what she was saying, that he needed time before he could even think about her. I respected that boundary, even as her harassment escalated. The school's winter formal approached, and Mateo surprised me by asking if we could go shopping for a suit together. Not at the designer stores Mel would have chosen, but at the department store where we'd always bought his school clothes. He tried on jackets while I sat in the fitting room chair, and for the first time in months, he asked my opinion. We debated between navy and charcoal, discussing it like the old days when every decision was a collaboration. His date was a girl named Jamie from his chemistry class, someone he'd known for years but only recently noticed. She came to the house before the dance, and I watched Mateo pin on her corsage with shaking hands. He'd asked me earlier how to do it properly, practicing on a paper flower until he got it right. Jamie's parents took pictures while I stood to the side, and Mateo pulled me in for one shot, his arm around my shoulders like it belonged there. After they left, I sat in the living room feeling something I hadn't in months. Hope. Maybe we could rebuild. Maybe the foundation we'd laid over 10 years was strong enough to weather this storm. I was cleaning up the kitchen when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A picture of Mel, thinner than before, standing outside Mateo's school. The message read, "He's still my son." I drove to the school immediately, my heart pounding. The dance was in full swing, music thumping from the gym, but I couldn't find Mel anywhere. I walked the perimeter of the building, checked the parking lot, even looked in the windows. Nothing. But the damage was done. She'd shown me she could get close to him whenever she wanted, that the restraining order was just paper if she chose to ignore it. The next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd drop Mateo at school and circle the block looking for her car. I'd sit in the parking lot during his practices, scanning for her face. He noticed my hypervigilance and called me out, said I was being paranoid. I showed him the photo then, watched his face go pale. He asked if I thought she'd try something, and I honestly didn't know what to tell him. We developed new routines built on caution. I'd walk him into school instead of dropping him at the curb. He'd text me when he arrived at practice, when he was leaving, when he got rides with friends. It felt like we were partners in protection rather than parent and child, united against a threat we couldn't predict. The closeness it created was bittersweet, born from fear rather than trust. His grades started slipping, just slightly, but enough for his AP history history teacher to email me. Mateo had always been meticulous about homework, but now assignments came back with careless errors. During parent-teacher conferences, I learned he'd been falling asleep in class, that dark circles had become permanent fixtures under his eyes. The insomnia he'd conquered as a child had returned with vengeance. I found him one night researching addiction genetics on his laptop, medical journals and studies scattered across his browser tabs. He'd highlighted passages about hereditary factors, environmental influences, the statistics on children of addicts. When he saw me looking, he slammed the laptop shut, but not before I saw the search history. How to know if you'll become an addict. Children of substance users. Breaking family cycles. I sat on his bed uninvited, something I hadn't done since he'd shut me out. I told him about my own fears at his age, how I'd wondered if Mel's choices were written in my DNA too, how I'd made conscious decisions every day to be different, to choose stability over chaos, to build instead of destroy. He listened without looking at me, picking at a thread on his comforter, but he was listening. The thread unraveled as he talked, words spilling out about his fears of becoming Mel, of hurting people he loved, of that genetic time bomb ticking in his cells. He'd been having dreams where he was the one showing up high at someone's door, begging for forgiveness for abandoning a child. The expensive things Mel had given him felt like poison now, evidence of how easily material goods had swayed him from someone who'd given him everything else. I reminded him that he'd walked away from those things, that when faced with the truth, he'd chosen substance over style, that his reaction to Mel's betrayal, the way it had broken him, proved he had empathy she lacked. Addiction might have genetic components, but choices were still choices. He had 10 years of making good ones, of being the kid who helped strangers with groceries, who tutored struggling teammates, who still cried at movies even though he tried to hide it. His phone lit up with a notification, and I saw him tense before checking it. Just his friend asking about homework, but we both knew he was waiting for Mel to find a way through our digital walls. She'd already proven she could adapt, evolve her tactics, find new ways to insert herself into our lives. The uncertainty was almost worse than direct contact would have been. I suggested we change his phone number, but he refused, said he wouldn't let her make him hide, wouldn't give her that power. It was a brave stance from a kid who'd been knocked down hard, and I respected it even as I worried. We compromised on new security settings, blocking unknown numbers, screening everything through filters, digital armor for a modern battle. The holidays approached with a weight they'd never carried before. Thanksgiving had always been our favorite, just the two of us cooking too much food, watching football, falling asleep on the couch. But now, every tradition felt fragile, like we were trying too hard to recreate something broken. Mateo went through the motions of helping me prep, but I caught him staring at nothing, lost in thoughts I couldn't reach. We were chopping vegetables when he asked if Mel had anywhere to go for Thanksgiving. The question hit me like a punch. This kid still worried about the woman who'd shattered him. I told him I didn't know, that it wasn't our responsibility to care. He nodded, but kept chopping, and I could see him wrestling with the complexity of loving someone who'd proven themselves unworthy of it. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cold. We cooked in relative silence, the kitchen filled with familiar smells but unfamiliar tension. Mateo made his grandmother's stuffing recipe from memory, the one I'd taught him years ago. He measured ingredients precisely, like accuracy could somehow fix everything else that felt off balance. I wanted to tell him it would get easier, but I wasn't sure that was true. We were setting the table when the doorbell rang. Mateo froze, his hands suspended over the plates. I moved toward the door, gesturing for him to stay back. Through the peephole, I saw a delivery driver holding a massive flower arrangement. I signed for it cautiously, checking the card. Happy Thanksgiving to my son. Love always, Mom. Mel had found another way in. Mateo read the card once, then walked to the garbage and threw the entire arrangement away, vase and all. The crash of glass in the bin was violent and final. He went back to setting the table without a word, but his hands shook as he folded napkins. We ate dinner pretending the flowers had never arrived, but they sat between us anyway, invisible and impossible to ignore. That night, I found him on the roof. He'd climbed out his bedroom window to sit on the slanted shingles, a dangerous perch he'd discovered in middle school. I joined him carefully, my fear of heights battling my need to be close. We sat looking at the stars, our breath visible in the cold air, neither of us mentioning that this was exactly where I'd found him the night he first called me Dad. He asked if I thought Mel would ever stop, if she'd keep finding ways to intrude on our lives. I told him the truth, that I didn't know, that addiction made people unpredictable and desperate, but I also told him we'd handle whatever came, that she could send 1,000 flowers and it wouldn't change the fundamental truth. I was his parent, he was my son, and that was built on years of showing up, not DNA or manipulation. School resumed with Mateo throwing himself back into his routine. Basketball season picked up intensity as playoffs approached, and he channeled his confusion into physical excellence. I watched him lead his team with a maturity that made me proud and sad simultaneously. He was 16 going on 30, aged by betrayal but not broken by it. His coach named him captain, a responsibility he accepted with quiet determination. The first playoff game drew a packed crowd. I sat in my usual spot, surrounded by parents I'd known for years. They asked about Mel carefully, having heard rumors but not details. I deflected their questions, focusing on the game, on Mateo's precise passes and defensive intensity. He played like someone with something to prove, not to others, but to himself. They won by 12 points, Mateo contributing a double-double that had scouts taking notes. After the game, he found me in the crowd first, his smile genuine for the first time in weeks. We went to our usual victory dinner spot, just the two of us, and he actually ate instead of pushing food around his plate. He talked about the game, breaking down plays, and for an hour we were just us again. But reality waited at home in the form of another package on our doorstep. This time it was a box of Mateo's baby photos, pictures I'd never seen. Mel must have had them all along, hidden away while I documented his life with my cheap camera. There he was as a newborn, as a 1-month-old, moments I'd missed because she hadn't brought him to me yet. The manipulation was surgical in its precision. Mateo looked through them once, his face unreadable. Then he handed them to me and went to his room. I sat with those photos, seeing my nephew's earliest days for the first time, feeling robbed all over again. Not just of those moments, but of the simple joy Mateo should have felt seeing baby pictures. Mel had weaponized even his history, turned innocent memories into emotional grenades. I kept the photos in a drawer, unsure what else to do with them. They were his history, complicated as it was, and someday someday he might want them, but not now. Not when every reminder of Mel felt like salt in fresh wounds. I focused instead on the photos we'd taken together, the decade of birthdays and holidays and random Tuesdays that built our real story. The playoffs continued with Mateo playing his best basketball ever. College scouts started appearing regularly, approaching me after games with business cards and promises. He had options for his future, paths leading away from this town and its memories. Part of me wanted him to take them, to build something new somewhere Mel couldn't reach, but I knew geography couldn't solve what haunted him. We were reviewing scholarship offers when his phone rang with an unknown number. He'd stopped answering those, but this time something made him pick up. I watched his face change, confusion, then recognition, then something like pity. He handed me the phone wordlessly. It was Mel's husband, or ex-husband now, calling to warn us she'd stolen his credit cards and disappeared. He thought we should know she was spiraling, that she might do something desperate. I thanked him for the warning. This man who'd enabled Mel's fantasy before abandoning her to reality. He apologized before hanging up, said he hadn't known what he was getting into, that she'd seemed so together when they met. I wanted to tell him that was her gift, seeming together just long enough to hook someone new. But I just ended the call and looked at Mateo, who was already pulling on his shoes. We spent that night securing our house like a fortress. New locks on all the doors, security bars for the ground floor windows, motion sensor lights that turned the yard into a stage. Mateo helped with everything, methodical and focused. We didn't talk about why we were doing it, but when we finished, he hugged me tight before bed. Fear had made us partners again, though I wished it could have been something else. Days passed without incident, but the waiting was exhausting. Every car that slowed near our house made us tense. Every unexpected knock sent adrenaline flooding. We were living under siege from someone who might never come, prisoners of possibility. Mateo's insomnia worsened, and I often found him sitting in the living room at dawn, watching the street through the blinds. His teacher called about an essay he'd written, concerned about its dark tone. He'd been asked to write about a defining moment, and he'd chosen the night Mel confessed her truth. But instead of anger, the essay radiated sadness, a deep grief for the mother he'd invented in his mind. His teacher wanted to know if he was getting help processing this trauma. I made an appointment with a therapist that day. Mateo resisted at first, said talking to strangers wouldn't change what happened, but I insisted, and he eventually agreed to try. I drove him to that first appointment, waited in the parking lot like I had when he was small and scared of the dentist. He came out 50 minutes later with red eyes, but seemed lighter somehow. He didn't share what they'd discussed, and I didn't ask. Some healing had to happen in private spaces. The therapy sessions became part of our new routine. Every Thursday after practice, I'd drive him across town to the counselor's office. While he talked through his pain with a professional, I sat in a nearby coffee shop, grading papers from the community college teaching job I'd picked up for extra money. We'd ride home together afterward, usually in comfortable silence, sometimes with music filling the space between us. One Thursday, he came out looking particularly drained. In the car, he told me the therapist had asked him to write a letter to Mel. Not to send, just to write, to put all his feelings somewhere outside his body. He'd tried but couldn't get past Dear Mom, the words feeling like lies on the page. How do you address someone who's both your mother and a stranger, your DNA and your destroyer? I shared that I'd written Mel dozens of letters over the years, especially in the early days when Mateo was small and difficult, and I didn't know if I could do it. Letters full of rage at her abandonment, full of begging for her to come back, full of updates she didn't deserve about his first words and steps. I'd burned them all eventually, but writing them had helped me process the complexity of raising her child while hating her choices. That weekend, Mateo's team made it to the championship game. The whole town buzzed with excitement, banners hanging from local businesses, everyone talking about our chances. Mateo handled the pressure with grace, signing autographs for younger kids, giving interviews to the school paper, but I could see the weight he carried, performing normalcy while his internal world remained in chaos. The morning of the big game, I made his favorite breakfast, the same meal we'd eaten before every important game since he was 8. He picked at his eggs, too nervous to eat much, but he smiled when I packed the leftovers for later. These rituals mattered more now, proof that some things remained constant despite the upheaval. We went through our usual pre-game routine, each movement a small comfort in its familiarity. The gym was packed beyond capacity, fire codes definitely being violated. I found my usual seat, surrounded by parents wearing team colors. The energy was electric, everyone ready to witness something special. Mateo warmed up with his team, his focus absolute. In these moments, basketball simplified his world to something manageable. Put the ball in the hoop, stop the other team from doing the same. The game started with brutal intensity. Both teams had everything to lose, and it showed in every possession. Mateo played like someone possessed, diving for loose balls, fighting through screens, directing his teammates with veteran leadership. By halftime, they were down by 8, and I could see frustration creeping into his movements. The coach pulled him aside during the break, and whatever he said worked. The third quarter belonged to Mateo. He scored 12 points in 8 minutes, each basket more confident than the last. The crowd went wild with every play, and I lost my voice cheering. His teammates fed off his energy, everyone elevating their game. They entered the fourth quarter tied, momentum fully shifted. I gripped my program so tight it tore, unable to sit still as the clock ticked down. With 30 seconds left, they were down by 2. The other team had possession, running out the clock. Then Mateo did something I'd seen him practice 1,000 times. A steal so clean the opponent didn't realize the ball was gone, until Mateo was already at half court. He drove to the basket as time expired, laying it in as the buzzer sounded. The gym exploded, teammates mobbing him at center court. In the chaos of celebration, I saw him looking for me in the stands. Our eyes met across the crowd, and he smiled, really smiled, for the first time since that night with Mel. I made my way down to the court, fighting through the crowd. When I reached him, he hugged me tight, sweaty and exhausted and triumphant. "We did it, Dad," he said, and I knew he meant more than just the game. The team celebrated at a pizza place downtown, the whole restaurant cheering when they walked in. Mateo sat with his teammates, laughing at their stories, finally looking like the teenager he was supposed to be. I sat with the other parents but kept watching him, seeing glimpses of the kid he'd been before everything went sideways. Maybe we couldn't go back, but we could build something new from the pieces. We got home after midnight, both exhausted but too wired to sleep. Mateo made hot chocolate while I found a replay of the game on the local local news. We sat watching his winning shot over and over, the announcer losing his mind with excitement. Mateo provided commentary, explaining what he'd seen in that moment, how he'd known exactly when to make his move. Strategy had always been his strength, seeing patterns others missed. As we cleaned up the kitchen, he told me the therapist had suggested family sessions. The idea of sitting in a room together, unpacking our shared trauma with a mediator, felt both necessary and terrifying. But Mateo wanted to try, said he had things to say that felt too big for our kitchen conversations. I agreed, knowing that healing rarely happened in comfortable spaces. Our first joint session was scheduled for the following week. I spent days anticipating it, wondering what would surface in that neutral room. Mateo seemed calmer about it, like he'd already decided what needed saying. The morning of the appointment, he made breakfast for both of us, a reversal that felt significant. We ate in companionable silence, both preparing for whatever came next. The therapist's office felt smaller with both of us in it. She explained how the session would work, that this was a safe space for honest communication. Then she turned to Mateo and asked what he wanted me to understand. He took a deep breath, looked at his hands, and began talking about the confusion of loving two versions of me, the uncle who raised him and the man who'd kept secrets about his mother. I listened as he explained how the expensive gifts from Mel had felt like proof that she'd always wanted him, that maybe I had kept them apart, how her lies had seemed possible because I'd never told him the worst parts, had always protected him from the full truth. He wasn't angry anymore, just sad about the innocence he'd lost, the simple story of our family that had become so complicated. When it was my turn, I talked about the impossible balance of protecting him while preparing him for eventual disappointment, how I'd wanted him to have hope that people could change, that his mother might become someone worthy of his love. I apologized for not trusting him with the truth earlier, for thinking I could shield him from pain that was always going to find him eventually. The therapist guided us through the conversation, helping us hear each other without defensiveness. Mateo asked questions about those early years, things he'd wondered but never voiced. I told him about the nights I'd driven him around for hours because the car was the only place he'd sleep, about calling in sick to work when he was too fussy for daycare, about learning to be a parent through YouTube videos and library books. By the end of the session, we were both emotionally drained but clearer somehow. The therapist gave us homework, exercises in rebuilding trust and communication. We drove home quietly, processing what had been said and what still needed saying. That night, Mateo knocked on my door and asked if we could watch a movie, something we hadn't done in months. We fell asleep on the couch, the distance between us finally starting to close. The next morning brought a new crisis. The school called to say Mateo hadn't shown up for first period. I checked his room and found it empty. Bed made, backpack on. Panic flooded through me as I called his phone, getting voicemail immediately. I was about to call the police when I remembered the tracking app we'd installed after Mel's photo threat. He was at the cemetery where my parents were buried. I found him sitting between their headstones, talking quietly to grandparents he'd never met. He looked up when I approached, no surprise on his face. He'd been telling them about Mel, about me, about the mess our family had become. He said he'd needed to talk to someone who couldn't take sides, who existed outside our current pain. I sat beside him, understanding the need for neutral ground. We stayed there for an hour, taking turns talking to parents who couldn't answer, but somehow still provided comfort. Mateo asked about their relationship with Mel, whether they'd seen the addiction coming. I told him what I remembered, how they'd tried everything to help her before their car accident when I was 20, how losing them had sent Mel spiraling faster, leaving me to pick up pieces I didn't know how to hold. He pulled out a letter then, folded and refolded until the creases were soft. The letter to Mel he'd finally managed to write. He asked if I wanted to read it, but I shook my head. That was between them, even if she'd never see it. Instead, he lit it on fire using the candle someone had left on my mother's grave, watching his words turn to ash and float away. Closure came in different forms. We stopped for breakfast on the way home, sitting in a booth at the pancake house where we'd celebrated every milestone. Mateo ordered his usual, and I realized how much I'd missed these mundane moments. He talked about college applications, about wanting to stay close but not too close. He'd been researching schools with good psychology programs, inspired by his therapist to maybe help other kids navigate family trauma. The acceptance letters started arriving in spring, each one opening new possibilities. Mateo had options, scholarships to schools that would take him far from here. Part of me wanted him to go, to build a life untouched by Mel's chaos. But he surprised me by choosing the state university 2 hours away, close enough to come home but far enough to be his own person. He said he wasn't running from our history anymore. As graduation approached, we fell into preparation mode, shopping for dorm supplies, attending orientation, filling out endless forms, normal parent-child activities that felt extraordinary after everything we'd survived. Mateo even asked if we could take a road trip that summer, just the two of us, before everything changed. We started planning routes, debating beaches versus mountains, both pretending we weren't trying to create memories to sustain us through separation. Then, 3 weeks before graduation, Mel surfaced again, not dramatically this time, but through a lawyer requesting supervised visitation. She'd completed another rehab program, had 6 months clean, wanted to make amends. The letter was professionally written, hitting all the right notes of accountability and hope. Mateo read it once, handed it back to me, and said he'd think about it. We discussed it in therapy, weighing the risks and potential benefits. The therapist didn't push either direction, just helped Mateo explore his feelings. He was different now, stronger and clearer about his boundaries. If he decided to see Mel, it would be on his terms, with full awareness of who she was, rather than who he wished she could be. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. After a week of consideration, Mateo decided to meet her. 1 hour, supervised at the therapist's office. I drove him there, my own feelings a tangle of protection and resentment. He asked me to wait in the car rather than the waiting room, needing space from my emotions to feel his own. I agreed, spending the longest hour of my life parked outside, ready to be whatever he needed when it was over. He came out composed but tired, sliding into the passenger seat without immediate comment. We drove for 10 minutes before he spoke, telling me Mel had looked healthy but hollow. She'd apologized, taken responsibility, made no excuses, but when she'd talked about the future, about rebuilding their relationship, he'd seen the fundamental truth. She was still thinking about herself, what she needed from him, rather than what he might need from her. He'd told her he was glad she was clean, that he hoped she stayed that way, but he wasn't interested in a relationship. trip. Not now. Maybe not ever. He had a father, a family, a life built on steady love rather than dramatic gestures. She'd cried but hadn't pushed, and that small respect for his boundary was the only gift she could give him. They'd parted with a handshake, formal and final. We drove home in peaceful silence. Something settled between us. Mateo had faced his ghost and found it smaller than his fear. He'd chosen our quiet life over her promises, not from anger, but from wisdom earned too young. That night, we cooked dinner together, talking about anything except Mel. She'd taken enough of our time, our energy, our peace. We were done giving her power over our present. Graduation day dawned bright and perfect. Mateo woke early, nervous about his valedictorian speech. We'd practiced it together, but public speaking still made him anxious. I fixed his tie while he ran through the opening lines again, both of us pretending this wasn't a massive transition. He'd grown so tall I had to reach up now, this kid who'd once fit in the crook of my arm. The ceremony was beautiful torture, pride, and loss tangled together. When Mateo took the podium, I held my breath, but he spoke with confidence about resilience, about chosen families, about how the best things in life often came from unexpected places. He thanked his teachers, his coaches, his friends. Then he thanked his dad, who taught him that showing up was the only thing that mattered. I definitely wasn't crying. Afterward, we hosted a small party at the house. Friends and teammates stopped by, teachers who'd watched Mateo grow, neighbors who'd been part of our village. Someone had made a photo board of his journey, baby pictures through senior portraits. I noticed he'd included one of Mel holding him as an infant, acknowledgement without endorsement. He was learning to hold complexity without letting it hold him. As the party wound down, we found ourselves alone in the backyard. The same yard where we'd had water GN fights, where he'd learned to ride a bike, where we'd sat that terrible night when truth destroyed innocence. Now we sat as equals almost. Him heading to college, me trying to imagine life without daily proof of purpose. He'd be fine, I knew that. The question was whether I would be. He must have sensed my thoughts because he bumped my shoulder, said he wasn't going that far, promised to come home for Sunday dinners, to call when he needed laundry advice, to remember where he came from. Not the biological where, but the real one. The house where love was consistent and boring and exactly what he'd needed. We stayed outside until mosquitoes drove us in, neither ready to end this chapter. The summer passed too quickly, days filled with preparation and denial. We took that road trip, driving up the coast with no real plan. Mateo had inherited my terrible taste in music, so we sang along to classic rock while the ocean stretched beside us. We stopped at ridiculous tourist traps, ate at dive restaurants, stayed in motels with questionable reviews. It was perfect in its imperfection. 2 weeks of just being us without the weight of our history. On the last night of the trip, we sat on a beach watching the sunset. Mateo talked about his fears for college, normal worries about roommates and classes, rather than the existential questions that had plagued him. He was excited to study psychology, to maybe help kids like himself navigate family trauma. He'd turned his pain into purpose, alchemy I couldn't take credit for, but felt proud to witness. We drove home the next day, car loaded with souvenirs and sand and everything. The house felt different knowing he'd be leaving soon, each room holding memories that would have to sustain me. But I pushed down the melancholy, focusing on lists and logistics. There would be time for missing him after he left. Right now, he needed me present, not preemptively grieving. Move-in day arrived like a deadline I'd forgotten to prepare for. The car was loaded with everything he'd need, plus things he definitely wouldn't, but I'd insisted on anyway. The drive to campus felt both eternal and instant. Mateo chatted about his roommate, some kid named Nathan from 3 states away who also played basketball. Normal college talk that felt surreal coming from the boy I'd raised. His dorm room was tiny and perfect, a blank slate for whatever came next. We unpacked in companionable efficiency, years of working together making words unnecessary. His roommate arrived with equally nervous parents, and suddenly the room filled with strangers who had become Mateo's new normal. I felt myself pulling back, making space for his future to begin. When everything was unpacked and arranged, we stood awkwardly by his car. Other families were saying elaborate goodbyes, but we'd never been much for dramatic scenes. Mateo hugged me tight, whispered thank you for everything, then stepped back with shining eyes. I told him I was proud of him, that I loved him, that he knew where to find me. Then I got in my car and drove away before either of us could make it harder. The drive home was brutal, every mile increasing the distance between us. The house felt impossibly empty when I arrived, too quiet after years of basketball bouncing and video games and teenage boy energy. I stood in his doorway looking at the room he'd left neat as a pin, so different from his usual chaos. This was what success looked like, raising a kid who could leave. It felt like victory and loss all at once. That night I found a note he'd left on my pillow. Dad, it started, and I had to sit down. He thanked me for choosing him when it would have been easier not to, for showing him that family was about commitment, not chromosomes. He promised to make me proud, not knowing he already had every single day. He signed it, your son, always, and I kept that paper in my wallet until it fell apart at the creases. Life developed new rhythms without him. I threw myself into work, picked up extra classes, finally fixed all the house projects I'd been putting off. Sundays felt wrong without our meal prep, Wednesdays empty without superhero shows. But slowly I adjusted, finding purpose beyond active parenting. Mateo called regularly, texts coming at random moments. How do you get grass stains out? Is it normal for chicken to smell weird? I miss your lasagna. Proof he still needed me, just differently. He came home for Thanksgiving, somehow looking older after just 3 months. He filled the house with stories about professors and parties and the girl in his psych class who challenged everything he thought. I watched him move through our space with new confidence. This young man who'd survived so much and come out kind. We cooked together like always, but now he had opinions about seasoning and technique, evolution, not abandonment. Over dinner, he told me Mel had tried to contact him through social media. He'd blocked her immediately, not from anger, but from clarity about what he needed. He was building something new at school, friendships and possibilities untainted by our complicated history. He didn't owe her access to that, didn't owe her anything really. The decision came easy now, boundaries firm, but not bitter. We spent the weekend in comfortable patterns, watching movies and shooting hoops and pretending he wasn't leaving again. But Sunday came anyway, and I drove him back to school through light snow. His roommate Nathan was there when we arrived, and they immediately fell into conversation about their breaks. I unloaded Mateo's laundry and leftovers quickly, recognizing my cue to go. This was was his life now, and I was a welcome visitor, but visitor nonetheless. The second goodbye was easier. Practice making him perfect. Mateo walked me to my car, chatting about his final schedule and spring basketball league. Normal college kid concerns that delighted me with their mundanity. We hugged briefly, and he headed back inside to his future. I drove home through increasing snow, radio playing songs that reminded me of our summer road trip. The empty house waited, but it felt less lonely now, more like peaceful solitude than abandonment. I'd done it. Raised a baby who wasn't mine into a man who was absolutely my son. Despite Mel's chaos, despite my inexperience, despite every odd against us, Mateo was thriving, building a life on the foundation we'd created together. The story wasn't over, would never really end, but this chapter was closing gently. No dramatic confrontations or tearful revelations, just a kid going to college and a dad learning to let go. After everything we'd survived, normal felt like the greatest victory of all. Christmas break brought him home for 3 weeks, the house suddenly alive again. He'd made Dean's List, his psychology professor wanted him to assist with research, the girl from class had become something more. I listened to his excitement about the future, seeing glimpses of the counselor he might become, someone who understood broken families from the inside, who could sit with other people's pain because he'd learned to carry his own. We didn't talk about Mel much anymore. She existed in our history but not our present, a ghost who'd lost her power to haunt. Mateo had processed his grief in therapy, through writing, through choosing to focus forward. I'd found my own peace in watching him thrive despite her failures. We'd broken the cycle not through anger, but through daily decisions to be better, love steadier, show up consistently. New Year's Eve found us in our usual spot, the roof outside his bedroom window. We'd climbed up with hot chocolate and blankets, watching fireworks bloom across town. Mateo talked about switching his major to social work, wanting to be in the system that had helped us. He'd been volunteering at a youth center near campus, seeing himself in kids navigating family chaos. Purpose born from pain, the best kind of alchemy. As midnight approached, he got quiet, then he thanked me again, not dramatically but simply, for the normal childhood I'd carved out of chaos, for the stability that let him dream beyond survival, for choosing him every day for 10 years, then choosing to let him go. I told him that raising him had saved me too, given me purpose when I was just some lost 20-something. We'd raised each other really, two people building family from scratch. The fireworks exploded overhead, marking another year survived and transcended. Mateo would go back to school next week, continue becoming whoever he was meant to be. I'd return to my quiet house, my work, my life beyond active fatherhood, but we'd built something unbreakable in those 10 years, a bond that distance couldn't diminish. He was my son, I was his dad, and that truth existed beyond blood or law or anyone else's claim. We climbed down carefully, the roof icy now. Inside, we cleaned up our mugs and headed to bed. Tomorrow, we'd start packing his things for school, preparing for another goodbye. But tonight, we were just here, together, in the house where we'd become a family. It was enough. After everything, it was more than enough. It was home. Spring semester started with Mateo sending photos of his new apartment near campus. He'd moved off campus with Nathan and 2 other guys from the basketball team, ready for more independence. I helped him move in January, hauling furniture up 3 flights of stairs while he directed traffic. The place was a typical college apartment, mismatched furniture and empty pizza boxes already accumulating, but he was proud of it. I stayed to help him set up his room, hanging the framed photos he'd brought from home. There was one of us at his high school championship, another from our summer road trip, and tucked in the corner, that single baby photo of him with Mel. He'd made peace with keeping it, acknowledging his whole history without letting it define him. We assembled his desk in comfortable silence, years of building things together, making instructions unnecessary. Before I left, he showed me the volunteer schedule at the youth center. He was working with kids from broken homes, running basketball clinics that were really therapy sessions in disguise. He talked about one kid, Marcus, whose story echoed his own. Single grandmother raising him, mother in and out of the picture, anger masking hurt. Mateo's eyes lit up describing their breakthrough when Marcus finally opened up during a one-on-one drill. The drive home felt different this time, less like abandonment, more like natural progression. Mateo was building his own life, but our foundation remained solid. He called that night to make sure I'd gotten home safe, then launched into a story about his roommates attempting to cook dinner. The smoke alarm had gone off twice, and they'd ended up ordering Chinese. I laughed, remembering my own disasters at that age, grateful he felt comfortable sharing these moments. February brought unexpected news. My company was restructuring, and my position was being eliminated. At 36, I suddenly faced unemployment for the first time since college. The severance was decent, but panic crept in anyway. I'd built my whole adult life around providing stability for Mateo. Without that daily purpose, who was I? I didn't tell him immediately, not wanting to burden him during midterms, but he knew something was wrong when I answered his calls during what should have been work hours. When he pressed, I admitted the truth, trying to downplay my anxiety. He listened quietly, then said something that stopped me cold. He reminded me that I'd taught him resilience by example, that watching me figure things out as we went had been more valuable than any perfect plan. Now it was my turn to take that advice. I spent the next weeks updating my resume, a strange exercise in summarizing a life that had been devoted to raising someone else's child. How do you quantify midnight feedings and homework help and showing up to every game? But as I wrote, I realized I'd developed more skills than I'd credited myself with. Project management, crisis intervention, budget stretching, conflict resolution. Parenting had been my MBA. The job search was humbling. Interviews where people half my age asked about my 5-year plan, when I'd never been able to plan past Mateo's next milestone. But slowly, opportunities emerged. A position at a nonprofit working with at-risk youth caught my attention. The pay was less than my corporate job, but the mission felt right. When they offered it, I accepted immediately. Mateo came home for spring break just as I was starting the new job. He found me preparing for my first presentation to the board, nervous as a kid on the first day of school. He helped me practice, offering feedback with the same patience I'd shown him before big games. The role reversal felt strange, but right, evidence of the man he'd become. That week, we fell into easy routines. He'd study at the kitchen table while I worked on program proposals. We'd break for lunch, sharing stories about our respective worlds. He talked about switching his major to social work officially, about the professor who was mentoring him, about maybe getting a master's degree eventually. I watched him plan his future with the confidence of someone who knew he was loved and felt the last of my parenting anxiety ease. One evening, he brought up Mel again, not with pain this time, but curiosity. He wondered if she was still clean, where she was living, whether she ever thought about him. I told him I didn't know, that I'd stopped tracking her movements when he left for college. He nodded, said he'd been thinking about forgiveness lately, not for her sake, but for his own. Carrying anger was exhausting, and he had better uses for that energy. We were washing dishes when my phone rang. Unknown number, but something made me answer. It was a hospital 2 states away. Mel had listed me as her emergency contact, and she'd been brought in after an OD. She was stable, but refusing treatment. They needed someone to sign papers, to make decisions. I stood frozen, dish towel in my hand, while Mateo watched my face change. I told him after I hung up. He processed quietly, then asked what I was going to do. The old me would have rushed to handle it, to fix what couldn't be fixed. But I'd learned boundaries too. I called the hospital back, gave them her ex-husband's information, and removed myself from her emergency contacts. Mateo nodded approval, understanding that love sometimes meant stepping back. That night, neither of us could sleep. We ended up in the living room, talking about the complexity of family, addiction, and letting go. Mateo shared that he'd been reading about codependency in his psychology classes, recognizing patterns in how I'd tried to save Mel for years. He didn't blame me for it, understood I'd been young and trying to help, but he was glad I'd finally chosen my own peace. The next morning, he made breakfast while I got ready for work. Over eggs, he told me he'd decided to write his senior thesis on family systems and addiction, how children navigate parental substance abuse. He wanted to interview me as part of his research, to document our story academically. I agreed, proud that he could transform our pain into something that might help others. April arrived with acceptance letters for graduate programs. Mateo had options again, scholarships to schools with strong social work programs. He'd already decided to stay at the state university, building on the relationships he'd formed with professors and the community connections through his volunteer work. But he wanted my input, valued my opinion, even as he made his own choices. We spent a weekend visiting the campus again, this time looking at it through graduate student eyes. He showed me the building where he'd likely have his assistantship, introduced me to the professor who would be his advisor. She pulled me aside, told me Mateo was one of the most insightful students she'd taught. His personal experience gave him empathy that couldn't be learned from textbooks. As we walked across campus, Mateo pointed out all the places that had become important to him. The library where he'd had his first kiss with Sarah, the girl from psych class who was now his girlfriend, the counseling center where he still went monthly, maintaining his mental health proactively, the basketball court where he played pickup games, sport becoming joy again instead of escape. Sarah joined us for dinner that night. I'd met her briefly at Thanksgiving, but this was our first real conversation. She was studying to be a teacher, drawn to special education after growing up with a brother on the autism spectrum. She and Mateo balanced each other, her steadiness complementing his intensity. Watching them together, I saw a healthy relationship built on mutual respect, nothing like the chaos we'd known. After dinner, Sarah headed to her apartment, and Mateo and I drove home. He talked about their plans to get an apartment together next year, his voice careful like he was worried I'd disapprove. I told him I was happy he'd found someone who saw his worth, who understood his history without being defined by it. He relaxed, started sharing their discussions about the future, careers they wanted to build, the life they imagined. May brought finals and preparation for his graduation. This one felt different from high school, less like an ending and more like a beginning. Mateo had found his path, one that transformed trauma into purpose. He'd be starting his graduate program in the fall, already lined up to work with at-risk youth through the university's outreach program. Everything was falling into place naturally. I took time off work to help him pack up his apartment. 4 years of accumulated life filled box after box. He was more sentimental than I'd expected, keeping ticket stubs from games we'd attended, notes I'd left in his lunch bags freshman year. We found the letter he'd written me before leaving for college, tucked in a journal he'd kept. He let me read it. 4 years of growth evident in how he'd processed our journey. Graduation day was perfect, sunny and warm. Sarah's family sat with me, treating me like I belonged without question. When Mateo crossed the stage, I cheered loud enough for 2 parents, not caring who stared. He'd graduated magna fluid laude, with departmental honors, already accepted to graduate school. But more than academic achievements, he'd graduated into a man who understood himself, who'd broken cycles, who chose love over bitterness. The psychology department held a reception where Mateo received an award for his volunteer work. His supervisor from the youth center spoke about his impact, how kids who wouldn't talk to anyone else opened up to him. She shared a story about Marcus, the kid Mateo had mentioned, who was now applying to colleges himself. Mateo had become what he'd needed at that age, proof that circumstances didn't determine destiny. That evening, we had dinner at the same restaurant where we'd celebrated his high school championship. So much had changed, but the core remained. He told me he'd been offered a graduate assistantship that would cover his tuition plus a stipend. He wouldn't need my financial help anymore, though he quickly added he'd still need everything else. I laughed, assured him I wasn't going anywhere. Sarah joined us for dessert, and I watched them plan their summer. They were going to work at a camp for kids from foster care, combining their skills to create programming that addressed trauma through activities. Mateo's eyes lit up describing the basketball clinic he'd run, how he'd weave in lessons about emotional regulation, teamwork as trust building. He'd found his calling. As we left the restaurant, Mateo pulled me aside. He thanked me again, but differently this time. Not the desperate gratitude of a kid who'd almost lost everything, but the mature appreciation of a man who understood the weight of what I'd done. He said he hoped to be half the parent I'd been whenever that time came. I told him he'd be better, that each generation had the chance to improve on the last. The summer passed quickly. Mateo and Sarah left for camp after a week at home. He called regularly with stories about the kids, the breakthroughs and setbacks, the exhaustion and exhilaration of the work. I heard myself in his voice when he talked about a particularly difficult child, the determination to reach kids others had written off. He was becoming the professional I'd been the amateur version of. I used the quiet summer to settle into my own new life. The nonprofit job had become fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. I was developing programs for parents navigating the system, teaching skills I'd learned through trial and error. My supervisor asked me to lead a workshop on kinship care, recognizing that my experience was expertise. I'd never thought of myself as an expert in anything, but maybe I was. August arrived too soon. Mateo came home from camp transformed, darker from the sun and lighter in spirit. He and Sarah had decided to get that apartment together, had already signed a lease near campus. He asked if I'd help them move in, wanting my approval of the space. I agreed, happy to be included but recognizing the shift. I was becoming extended family rather than daily presence, and that was exactly as it should be. The apartment was small but bright, with a view of the mountains. We spent a day assembling furniture and arranging rooms. Sarah's parents helped too, and I found myself part of a larger family system. Her mother and I bonded over the strange grief of children growing up, the pride mixed with loss. By the end of the day, the apartment felt like home, and I could picture Mateo building his life there. Before I left, Mateo showed me his desk setup, where he'd work on his thesis. He'd already started outlining, weaving together research and personal narrative. He asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed on record, to have our story officially documented. I agreed, understanding this was his way of honoring what we'd built while moving beyond it. The thesis would be his story to tell. September came with new routines. Mateo started graduate school, diving into advanced coursework with enthusiasm. He called weekly with updates, questions about child development that made me dig deep into memories of his early years. Sometimes Sarah would join the calls, and I'd find myself offering relationship advice based on years of navigating complex family dynamics. They listened with the patience of kids who knew they were loved. I'd settled into my own rhythm too. Work was challenging but meaningful, using my story to help others navigate similar paths. I'd started dating someone, a teacher named Linda, who understood complicated families. She had her own story of raising her nephew after her sister's death. We bonded over the unique challenges of chosen parenthood, the way it shaped everything that came after. October brought unexpected news through the family grapevine. Mel had been arrested again, this time for theft. She'd been living in a halfway house, had stayed clean for almost a year before relapsing. The details were sparse, but I knew the cycle well enough to fill in the blanks. I debated telling Mateo, not wanting to disrupt his peace, but secrets had caused enough damage in our family. He took the news calmly when I called, said he'd been expecting something like this, that addiction rarely followed a straight line. He asked if I knew which facility she'd been sent to, then surprised me by saying he might write to her, not to reconnect, but to let her know he was okay, that despite everything, he'd built a good life. It might help her to know the damage wasn't permanent, that he'd found ways to heal. I supported his decision, recognizing the growth it represented. He wasn't trying to save her or seeking closure. He just wanted to offer a kindness that cost him nothing, but might mean something to her. He wrote the letter that week, keeping it brief and boundaried. He told her about graduate school, about his work with kids, about choosing to break cycles. He ended by wishing her peace, signing it simply, Mateo. November arrived with familiar rhythms. Mateo and Sarah came home for Thanksgiving, filling the house with warmth. Linda joined us, fitting naturally into our small family. We cooked together, Mateo teaching Sarah our traditional recipes, while I showed Linda the specific way he liked his stuffing. The kitchen felt full in the best way. Chosen family creating new traditions while honoring old ones. Over dinner, Mateo announced they were engaged. Sarah showed off a simple ring, perfect for her practical nature. They'd marry after graduate school, wanted to be established in careers first, but they knew they were building a life together, had known since those first psychology classes. I toasted them with tears in my eyes, seeing the cycle truly broken. He'd found healthy love, built on friendship and respect. That weekend, we started planning, not the wedding itself, but the life they wanted to build. Mateo talked about opening a practice focused on family trauma. Sarah wanted to develop curriculum for kids with learning differences. They dreamed of a house with space for the children they'd foster, maybe adopt. Kids who needed what Mateo had needed, what I'd tried to give him. The cycle breaking and reforming into something beautiful. December came with finals and preparations for the holidays. Mateo was deep in his thesis, interviewing other kinship families, building a framework for understanding resilience. He'd interviewed me twice already, digging into memories I'd buried. It was painful, but cathartic, seeing our story through academic eyes. He was careful with the details, protective of our privacy, while honest about our struggles. 2 weeks before Christmas, I got a call from an unknown number. Almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Mel, calling from prison. She'd received Mateo's letter, wanted to thank me for raising him right. Her voice was thin but clear, the most lucid I'd heard her in years. She didn't ask for anything, didn't make excuses, just said she was glad he was okay, that knowing he was thriving helped her stay motivated in treatment. I kept the call brief but not unkind, told her Mateo was engaged in graduate school, building a career helping kids like himself. She cried quietly, said she was proud even though she had no right to be. Before hanging up, she asked me to tell him she loved him, had always loved him even when she couldn't show it. I said I'd pass along the message, though we both knew love required more than words. I told Mateo about the call that evening. He listened thoughtfully, then said he was glad she'd reached out to me instead of him. He wasn't ready for direct contact, might never be. But knowing she was trying again, that his letter had meant something, gave him a different kind of closure. Not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. Sometimes that was all you could hope for with addiction. Christmas Eve found us all together again. Mateo and Sarah, Linda and me, chosen family creating traditions. We exchanged gifts, nothing expensive, but everything thoughtful. Mateo gave me a framed photo from his graduation, the two of us smiling at the camera. On the back, he'd written, "Thank you for choosing me every day." I had to excuse myself to the bathroom, overwhelmed by how far we'd come. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found Mateo on the roof, our old spot, though he barely fit through the window now. We sat in comfortable silence, looking at stars obscured by city lights. Finally, he spoke about the future. His thesis was almost done, job prospects were good, life was unfolding as planned, but he worried about me, wondered if I'd be okay when he didn't need me anymore. I assured him that needing and loving weren't the same thing, that I'd raised him to leave, and his independence was my success. I had my work, Linda, a life beyond active fatherhood, but I'd always be here, would always be dad, even when he didn't need daily proof. We stayed on the roof until the cold drove us inside. Neither of us mentioning this might be our last Christmas Eve roof session. The new year started with Mateo defending his thesis. I sat in the audience as he presented our story through academic lens, weaving personal narrative with research on resilience, attachment, and trauma. The committee asked hard questions, but he answered with authority born from lived experience. When they approved his work with distinction, I was the first person he looked for in the crowd. Afterward, at the celebration, his advisor pulled me aside. She said Mateo's work would be published, would help other families navigating similar situations. Our story, transformed through his perspective, would become a resource. I thought about 24-year-old me, desperate for guidance, and felt grateful that future versions of myself might find it in Mateo's words. Spring semester flew by with wedding planning and job interviews. Mateo accepted a position at a family services agency, starting after graduation. Sarah found a job at a school for kids with learning differences. They'd found a small house to rent, with a yard for the dog they planned to adopt. Everything falling into place naturally, a life built on solid foundation. I helped where asked, but mostly watched them create their future. The week before graduation, Mateo asked me to go through old photos with him. He was creating a slideshow for the wedding, wanted pictures from throughout our journey. We spent hours in boxes I hadn't opened in years, laughing at his terrible haircuts and my fashion choices. But underneath the laughter was something deeper, a recognition of all we'd survived to reach this moment. We found a photo from his first day of kindergarten, both of us terrified but trying to look brave. Another from the night he won that championship, pure joy on both our faces. Pictures from every birthday, holiday, random Tuesday that had built our life. At the bottom of the last box, wrapped in tissue, was the lamp he'd made in 3rd grade, the one Mel had broken that terrible night. He'd kept the pieces. He asked if I thought it could be fixed. I looked at the fragments, remembered the night everything shattered, told him some things couldn't be repaired, but you could create something new from the pieces. He nodded, understanding the metaphor, said he might try anyway, that broken things sometimes became more beautiful for having been mended. I helped him wrap the pieces carefully, another project for another day. Graduation arrived with less fanfare this time. Master's degree felt like continuation rather than transformation, but I sat in the audience with the same pride, watching him cross another stage. Linda held my hand as they called his name. Sarah cheered from the other side. Family in all its complicated forms, celebrating growth. He'd done it again, exceeded every expectation, including his own. The reception was smaller, just the social work graduates and their families. Mateo introduced me to his classmates, many of whom knew our story from his thesis. They thanked me for letting him share it, said it had helped them understand their own complicated families. I realized our story had already started rippling outward, touching lives we'd never meet. The pain transformed into purpose, reaching beyond us. That evening we had dinner at home, just the 4 of us, Linda and Sarah cooking while Mateo and I set the table. Normal domestic life that felt extraordinary for its simplicity. Over dessert, Mateo talked about his first day at the agency next week. He'd be working with kinship families, grandparents, and aunts and uncles, figuring out how to raise children they hadn't planned for. Full circle from where we'd started. After dinner, while the women chatted in the living room, Mateo helped me clean up. He moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, knowing where everything belonged. We worked in comfortable rhythm, years of shared tasks making words unnecessary. But as we dried the last dish, he spoke. Said he'd been thinking about forgiveness lately, not just for Mel, but for me, for the mistakes I'd made trying to protect him, for the times I'd gotten it wrong. I hadn't realized I needed that forgiveness until he offered it. The next morning, he and Sarah packed up to move to their new city. I helped load the truck, each box another step toward their independent life. Linda made sandwiches for their drive, already stepping into the role of bonus parent. We stood in the driveway as they prepared to leave, that familiar ache of goodbye mixing with excitement for their beginning. Mateo hugged me tight, whispered that he'd call when they arrived. Sarah hugged me too, promising to take care of him. I laughed, said they'd take care of each other, watched them drive away, hands linked over the center console. Linda put her arm around me as the truck disappeared around the corner, asked if I was okay. I was. Different than okay? Maybe. Complete. That night, I sat in Mateo's old room, still his room, even though he'd never live here again. I'd raised a child who wasn't mine into a man who absolutely was.